I guess, maybe I'm the person who's, the cup half empty instead of the cup half full here. It's more problems to me because according to the way the Jews, the more Orthodox Jews were living at that time, according to their law from Moses, they were to avoid uncleanliness with Gentiles, which was a large part of the argument Paul was having with the leaders in Jerusalem. But here we have in the Gospels, Jesus portrayed as consorting with people who would be unclean, violating the law, yet saying the law should be obeyed. And just on a common sense basis, it seems to me very unreasonable that Jesus could have been as popular a leader as he is portrayed, attracting large crowds, being greeted by a crowd when he comes into Jerusalem, and also be a person who was violating some of the most valued and revered kinds of laws that the Jews had at that day. It would be kind of like someone walking into a fundamentalist church now and saying, well, I'm the Son of God and I'm here to tell you that homosexuality is fine and abortion is fine. I think it would go over with the Jews back then about as well as that would today.
When you read the Gospels carefully, you'll notice that Jesus never contradicts the Old Testament law. What he does contradict is the Pharisees and Sadducees' interpretation of the law. That's what he's doing in Matthew 5 through 7 in the Sermon on the Mount. He says, "You've heard that it was said, 'Do not commit adultery.' But I tell you that if a man lusts after a woman, he's committed adultery with her in his heart." He's disagreeing with the interpretation of "do not commit adultery" as being no sexual penetration. And he's saying, no, the intent of that law is in your heart that a man not lust after a woman. Jesus says, you've heard that it was said, "Do not murder." But I tell you that if you hate someone, if you say to someone, "You idiot, you fool," you'll be in danger of the fire of hell. In other words, Jesus says, it is incorrect to interpret the law, "Do not murder," as simply meaning, don't end the guy's life. Instead, Jesus says, you're supposed to not hate the guy, you're supposed to respect him and try to love him. So it's the interpretation of the Old Testament law of the Pharisees and the Sadducees that Jesus is contradicting throughout the Gospels, particularly the Pharisees and Sadducees' interpretation of the Sabbath laws. Man, Jesus drives them bonkers on that one.
Well, I would agree, particularly in the Sermon on the Mount, that Jesus is disagreeing with the Pharisees and Sadducees and scribes, and he disagrees with them in many other places. In particular, many of the kinds of comments that Jesus has in the Sermon on the Mount are not loosening of the strictures of the law according to the kind of law he seems to be fighting. They actually seem to be stricter interpretations of the law. For example, on marriage, he seems to be a stricter interpretation, and some of the other things you'd mentioned. In fact,
exactly.
some of those interpretations or even appear in some of the Dead Sea Scrolls are very similar types of approaches to interpreting the law of Moses more strictly, which would, in my mind, strengthen the idea that Jesus is there to uphold the law of Moses, and in an even more strict sense, not found a new church in competition with the covenant with Israel and the law of Moses.
Okay, you're right. Obviously, Jesus had a stricter view of the marriage commitment than what Moses allowed for. Very clearly. But you see, his point is, Moses allowed you guys to divorce your wives because of the hardness of your hearts. And then Jesus, what he does is he goes right back to Genesis 2:24 and he says, but it was not that way from the beginning. For at the beginning, the Creator made them male and female and said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother, be united to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So obviously what Jesus is doing is he's saying, guys, let's go back to God's intent when he gave us this law, or when he set up marriage. And when God set up marriage, he did not have divorce in mind. But even there in Matthew, Jesus allows for divorce when there's adultery.
I guess, though, if I wanted to be a Christian, that I would come to the conclusion from what Jesus says in Matthew 5 and how he talks about some of the laws in a halakhic fashion, throughout some of the Gospels, that I should be an even more observant kind of Jew, following all of the laws, ceremonial, food, and moral, as well as, to the level it was in Moses, and even more so. I would be some kind of a super Jew and not a traditional idea of a Christian.
No, it's real obvious that Jesus did not call us to be super Jews. And the apostles had that very clear, and they make it very clear in the book of Acts and in the epistles and in the letters. A Gentile Christian does not have to become a super Jew.
Well, the letter of James would seem to maybe be a bit different than that, and the letter of James certainly has some disagreements with what Paul says, in, some of what Paul says in Galatians and Romans, in the faith
Not
versus
one
works
disagreement.
sort of thing.
James
I
does
think
not
so.
disagree with Paul once.
Oh, I think so.
Well, give me an illustration.
Well, Paul talks about salvation through grace.
Yeah.
And it's not just works, or not just by following a rote law,
Right.
that sort of thing.
Right?
And James basically says you need both.
Yeah. And I can promise you, there's no way that you can read Paul and say, yeah, Paul was antinomian. You can just believe and then go out and live like the devil. Paul called that hypocrisy all over the place. Paul wrote that the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Paul whammed away at sexual immorality, whammed away at lack of generosity towards hurting people, and James does the same thing. So Paul and James do not contradict each other. They both are basically saying, put your faith in Christ and live out that faith. There are ethical implications of your faith in Christ.
Well, it seems to me that there is a contradiction from the standpoint that James makes the point that works are necessary in addition to faith, and then there's also the the argument in Jerusalem, where James sends Paul to the church for purification ceremonies, and then there's the bit in Antioch where Paul is apparently having table fellowship with the Gentiles, and Peter's coming and described as going through that, and then some from James tells him, hey, don't do that, which is, the leader of the Jerusalem community at that point saying, really, in fact, those food laws and purity laws do still hold for the followers of Jesus. And Paul's Paul's on the other side of that argument, and even loses Barnabas, I guess it is at that point. It's one of his followers.
Sir, this is really, really simple. I hate to tell you. Obviously, the New Testament teaches that Gentiles do not have to buy into the ceremonial food laws of the Jewish nation. Obviously, Jesus, Paul, and James communicate you're saved by grace through faith, but if that faith is not on display in your ethics, you better go back and question the genuineness of your faith. How, sir, can you read the Gospels where Jesus tells the parable of the sheep and the goats about feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, visiting those sick in prison, and walk away saying, Jesus just said you got to believe in me, and it's not going to have any ethical implications? You read some of those parables of Jesus, and it almost sounds like he's saying the way to heaven is by feeding the hungry, clothing the naked. You better read in context. Obviously, Jesus taught you put your faith in me and you go to heaven, but that faith in Christ has profound ethical implications. Paul does the same thing. Paul communicates, you guys are going to heaven because your faith in Christ, not because your works. But when you put your faith in Christ, you got to obey Jesus. And obviously what James is doing is he's attacking this superficial idea of faith that it's just intellectual assent to some facts. And James says, no. If your lifestyle doesn't show that you take Jesus seriously, then you better go back and question your faith. Now, you guys know that. You guys know that if after standing out here talking about Jesus, I go out and you watch me womanize, you're going to point your finger in my face and you're going to say, Cliffe, you're a hypocrite. Well, when you call me a hypocrite for womanizing after I claim to be a follower of Christ, that is vice complementing virtue. Saying, yeah, don't give me this lie that you're following Christ when you go out and womanize all over the place. Because you guys know very well that Jesus commanded his followers to live sexually pure lives. So there's this tension in Jesus, Paul, and James between you put your faith in Christ, but by gollies, if that faith is genuine, it's going to be shown in your lifestyle. And you've got that throughout the New Testament. You don't have James contradicting Paul or Paul contradicting Jesus. They're in agreement. Faith in Christ. But if that faith is genuine, it's going to be on display in the way you love people.